I may very well have found my new paddle. I got my hands on the new Bread Butter Locos a couple of weeks ago, and I did have high expectations, but I didn't realize just how good these were going to be. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I'm not gonna lie, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Bread Butter. For one, I think they bring a really fun element to paddles with their designs, and two, they're run by some incredible people. Even before inviting all the YouTubers out to the Nerdy Tourney this summer, Doug and his crew had always been very supportive of the store, very responsive, and just generally stand-up people. And of course, yes, that tournament was amazing. The amount of detail and care that went into planning it so that everyone could enjoy it as much as possible was just awesome. And then meeting Doug and his family, I can tell you that on a human level, this is a company I want to support. The thing about Bread Butter is that up until now, their paddles had been good, but always just a bit late to the technology game or a step under the best. They've always represented pretty good value, but it wasn't always easy to say go for one of their paddles over something else. Well, that just changed with the release of these brand new Locos, which by the way has nothing to do with the older Widebody Kevlar Loco. That was a good paddle, but these are completely different, both in terms of technology and just performance in general. These are instantly contenders for Paddle of the Year, and I really wanted to make a video that represents them in their best light, and I can't think of a better way to do that than comparing them to the Selkirk Boomstick. The Boomstick is the best paddle I've ever tested, but it also happens to cost over 500 Canadian dollars after tax, so finding an alternative is obviously a must for most people, and while the Loco isn't exactly like the Boomstick, it's similarly impressive in its performance. So I'm going to do a deep dive comparison between these two to explain how the Loco is different, where it might be not as good, but also how it might actually be a better paddle in certain ways. I won't factor price into the equation until the end of the video, where I'll tell you which type of player should pick one over the other, because I do want to compare them purely off of their own performance metrics, but I'll tell you right now, if value is important, then this is a no-brainer. The Loco is not half as good as the Boomstick. Again, it's different, and there are reasons to go for the Boomstick over the Loco, which I'll explain, but there is no competition in terms of value between the two. Now, before I get into the technology and specs, I do just want to remind you, as usual, that any of the paddles I talk about on this channel, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Okay, so first I want to go over the specs of each Loco before getting into the technology, because that's actually one of the great things about this line. There are 3 different Loco shapes. A lot of brands will make 1 or maybe 2 shapes with the same technology, but Bread Butter has given us all 3, an elongated, a hybrid, and a wide body, which is really awesome, and I don't understand why more brands don't do this. I don't think it takes a ton of effort to just copy and paste a design into different shapes, and this just opens up the Loco to pretty much every type of player as long as this playability suits your game. Now, the one I spent most time on court with, as usual, was the elongated. This paddle is 16.5 inches long, it has a 5.5-inch handle, a 16mm core, and it weighs between 7.8 and 8 ounces. The swing weight comes in between 118 and 120, and the twist weight is 6.28. That static weight is quite low, and the swing weight is nothing crazy, so there is room to add weight here if you want to. The Boomstick has a much higher static and twist weight, and that's mainly due to this MOI tuning system here, which is basically Selkirk's way of customizing the paddle, but doing it in stock form. I will talk about how this weight on the sides is very important to the Boomstick's playability, and how you can actually do the same to the Loco if you want to get similar benefits out of it. Now, moving on to the wide body, that paddle is 16 inches long with a 5.3-inch handle. It weighs between 8 and 8.1 ounces. It has a swing weight between 108 and 110 and a 7.3 twist weight, and then of course the same 16mm core. This has become the standard wide body design at this point, and in comparison, the wide body Boomstick has a longer handle and then also a higher twist weight at 8.2. And then finally, there's this hybrid Loco, which I did spend some time on court with and actually really enjoyed. This paddle is 16.2 inches long with a 5.3-inch handle. It weighs between 7.9 and 8.1 ounces. It has a swing weight between 112 and 115 and a 6.65 twist weight, and again, that same 16mm core. Obviously, Selkirk doesn't have a hybrid Boomstick, so you've only got this one to choose from there, and that's a huge point to Bread Butter in this comparison. Now again, I did spend most of my time on court with the elongated versions of these paddles, so this will be more of a comparison between these two, but most of what I say can be translated to the wide bodies as well. Now, in terms of technology, the Loco has what is becoming pretty common for these powerful Gen 4s. It's an EPP foam core surrounded by an EVA foam ring. The Boomstick has pretty much the same thing with Selkirk Selkirk's pure foam making up the majority of the core, and then their EVA foam ring surrounding it. The interesting thing with the Loco is that there's actually a layer of fiberglass underneath the raw carbon T700 top sheet, which is there to increase pop, and it's definitely noticeable, which I'll talk more about later. But that's it for the technology and specs. We gotta move on to playability now. On paper, it might not seem like the differences are that important, but when you dig a little deeper, there are lots of little nuances between these two paddles, so let's start with the feel. So just bouncing a ball on the Loco in store, at face value, it feels very similar to what we've come to expect from these powerful Gen 4s with the EPP core and the EVA ring around them. It's very poppy, it's very powerful, and when I compare it to something like a Yola Pro 4, which is also a very powerful paddle, the dwell time is shorter here, and it's also more muted because that's just how EPP foam feels compared to honeycomb. And this is exactly how I would describe a Boomstick, a J2NF, a Quanta. But once you start comparing them side by side, you realize they're actually quite different. On a macro scale, they're similar compared to other types of paddles, but to really understand those differences in playability, you have to dive deeper into that feel. The Boomstick has a very hollow feel and an instantaneous responsive pop off the paddle face. The dwell time gets a little longer the harder you swing, but not much, and that's where the Loco is very different. The Loco is noticeably plusher on any type of shot, but that increase in dwell time becomes more and more obvious the harder you swing. It's got a spongier overall feel, which gets closest to the True Foam Genesis compared to any other Gen 4 that has an EVA foam ring. Remember, the Genesis doesn't have that. The entire core is made from EPP foam, which is why it's so much spongier and less poppy than the EVA Gen 4s. Now don't get me wrong, the Loco is still much poppier than the Genesis, but it does color between those lines more than any of its competitors, and that really impressed me. The other thing I like about the Loco is the actual feel on contact. Again, it is more muted than honeycomb, and that's always going to be the case with EPP foam paddles, but it is less muted than average, especially compared to the Boomstick, which is really muted. There's a lot more feedback here, and I think that's thanks to the little layer of fiberglass they added. I've always liked fiberglass. Yes, it adds some pop, but more importantly, at least to me, it adds this crisper, almost juicy feel like taking a bite out of an apple, and that's exactly what you get here. This has the most feedback for this style of paddle, so that's a huge bonus, and it was something I really appreciated throughout my playtest, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to control. The one little problem with feel I had on the Loco, especially at the beginning of my playtest, was switching between slower touch shots and faster pace shots. Anytime you have a dynamic paddle like this, that transition point can get a little blurry. That's what happens when you throw all these different foam densities together. One is softer and more powerful, one is firmer and more muted. It's up to the brand to make sure that that all fits symbiotically. And they absolutely can. The Boomstick is a perfect example of that. This paddle has a very linear transition in terms of dwell time and feel at different swing speeds, which makes it an easy paddle to understand despite it being muted and very powerful. That's clearly something Selkirk focused a lot of R&D on, and it's super important with these EVA foam paddles, and not everyone has that. The Quanta, for example, suffers a lot in that regard. There's a major disconnect between touch shots and powerful shots and everything in between. Now, I want to make it clear, the slight problem I had with that on the Loco is nowhere near as much of an issue as I had on the Quanta. In fact, this is very close to the Boomstick. It still wasn't quite perfect at the beginning of my test on the Loco though, and one of the things that helped big time with the Quanta was adding weight, so I figured, let's try that here. That could help eliminate those issues altogether. Sure enough, adding a little bit of weight to the sides just smoothed everything out. I didn't have any more problems with ambiguousness during dwell time. That weight made it become pretty much as consistent as the Boomstick. At this point, this paddle never surprises me. I always know what to expect off the face, and even when I hit a bad shot, I know that I did right away. So overall, the feel experience on a Loco is incredible. The key takeaways here are a slightly longer and spongier dwell time than most EVA and EPP foam paddles, better ball feel as well, and then whatever slight inconsistency issues I had in stock form go away completely with a little bit of weight. Those characteristics will obviously be super important once we start talking about spin, power, and control, so just keep them in mind. But if we are keeping score here, in terms of feel, I do prefer the Loco over the Boomstick. It's more nuanced, more connected overall, and just a little bit more enjoyable to hit the ball with, at least once you get over that initial what the heck moment with the Boomstick and its insane power. Now we're going to move on to sweet spot, and this is one area where I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The Loco can't compete with the Boomstick, but honestly, no one can. The Boomstick has the most ridiculously big sweet spot I've ever felt on any paddle, racket, whatever piece of court sport equipment you want. I don't know exactly how they did this. I know the MOI tuning system is a lot of it, but it's not just that. Never once have I played with a paddle that has what feels like zero drop off in playability on off-center hits. This is quite remarkable engineering by Selkirk, and it does absolutely help you on the court. Now, that's not to say that the Loco's sweet spot isn't big, because it is. It's a very large sweet spot compared to pretty much every other paddle. Especially after I added weight to the sides here, that expands it a little bit, and it makes this paddle more playable and stable on off-center hits. Just generally speaking, the sweet spots on EPP foam paddles are very big, just because it's a much more forgiving material than rigid honeycomb, and this is the biggest of the normal EPP and EVA foam paddles, all the ones that aren't the Boomstick. So if I'd never tested the Boomstick, I would tell you the Loco with customization is as good as it gets, but the Boomstick does exist, so it's not. You can even feel it when you're just bouncing a ball on either paddle. With the Boomstick, if you go from in the middle of the paddle to outside, it just feels like nothing changes. Here you go from in the middle of the sweet spot to outside, and you start feeling that little wobbly, unstable feel. Again, not bad, this is just a unicorn. Now, I was thinking maybe what makes the Boomstick so special is the weight on the side, so I added more and more and more to the Loco to try and match that twist weight and see if I could get a similar sweet spot. But no, there is just something special about the Boomstick. There are diminishing returns to the amount of weight you add. At some point, that sweet spot just caps out, and the extra weight does nothing except for take away from hand speed and maneuverability. What I ended up landing on as my perfect customization here was 4.5 inches of half-inch lead on either side of the paddle. That's what I found the Loco needs to become super smooth and consistent. So between sweet spot and feel, the sweet spot is so big on the Boomstick that feel almost doesn't matter, because a miss hit isn't actually a miss hit, so you don't care about making perfect contact in that sweet spot. But I am still going to call it a draw between the two. This does have a better connection to the ball. It feels more rewarding. It makes you actually want to hit the center of the paddle, which you do want to do. The Boomstick almost feels like you're cheating, and you can get away with playing bad shots. The Loco does still force you to play better pickleball, which in the long run is probably a good thing. So I hope I made this whole feel and sweet spot experience as clear as possible. It is, to me, the biggest difference between these two paddles, and it's very important as we get into more playability. So let's move on to power. I know I said the Loco has a very smooth feel compared to a lot of the other EPP and EVA foam Gen 4s, but I don't want anyone confusing smooth with it having low power. When I say smooth, I mean it's consistent, but it's consistently very powerful. On full pace strokes, so on ground strokes and on serve, you get a ton of extra pace on the ball. The Boomstick is still a little bit more powerful. It's the most powerful paddle I've ever tested, but I will say the difference is marginal and not too important in practice. This is in that same high tier of power paddles that can help you keep your opponent pushed back on their baseline so they don't have time to latch onto a ball that can take them to the net, and that's extremely valuable in singles. So I know I described this as spongier, and I even compared it to the Genesis, which is not that powerful of a paddle, but think of this more as like a Genesis that took a few too many shots of espresso thanks to that EVA foam ring. Yes, it's smoother and slightly plusher than paddles like the Quanta and the NF, but it's not spongy to the point where you feel the ball lose energy during dwell time. It's just spongy enough to give you some extra dwell time, but not spongy to the point where it takes away from power. So super impressed with its power on full pace strokes. And then in terms of pop, it's a similar story. Tons of pop on volleys and more compact shots. It's a very responsive pop too. So if you're like me and haven't mastered the art of the pickleball volley yet, and you're still sometimes just sticking out the paddle like in tennis, it does redirect pace very efficiently. Now again, the Boomstick does have a bit more pop, and unlike what I was saying for power at the baseline, I do think that marginal increase is more important up at the net. For one, a tiny bit of extra pop on the ball means less reaction time for your opponent, which could be the difference between winning and losing a hand battle, and that's a big point to the Boomstick. The other thing is that because the Boomstick sweet spot is so big, it doesn't really lose power on off-center hits, and that's extremely valuable up at the net when you don't have time to be super precise with your contact. But again, the Boomstick is a bit of a unicorn in that regard. Compared to pretty much every other paddle, the Loco is elite for power anywhere on the court, and very much will help you end points with power alone. Now we're going to move on to control. And yes, the Loco is a power paddle through and through, but there's one thing I want to make very clear here. High power is absolutely okay as long as it doesn't make a paddle uncontrollable. Those two are not mutually exclusive, but it is very difficult to make a power paddle controllable. The only way you can keep a power paddle controllable is by making sure that its power is consistent, because consistency is how a player develops trust in their paddle, which is crucial in the control game. A lot of power paddles are inconsistent. That was a major problem with Gen 3s, especially after break-in, and it's still a problem with some EVA Gen 4s like the Rhombus Quanta. With a paddle like that, sometimes if I overpower a touch shot, I'll look at my paddle and be like, I don't think that's the input I put into the ball, and that's because there isn't a smooth transfer of power at different swing speeds. That never happened with the Loco, especially after customization. When I did screw up, I knew right away it was my fault. There was no little hesitation where I looked at the paddle thinking, what is going on here? I'm not saying it's ever the paddle's fault, but that does happen with some power paddles. They do seem to have a bit of a mind of their own at times, but the best power paddles don't, and this is very much one of those. And so is the Boomstick. Yes, it adds a ton of power, but it's never random, so these are 1 and 2 in terms of power paddles that also give you a lot of confidence in the touch game, as long as you have soft hands. What I will say is that because the Loco does have more dwell time and also better feel than the Boomstick, it does give you that little extra split second to almost edit your shot while the ball is in the paddle face. The Boomstick isn't bad for touch shots. I don't want anyone thinking I'm trying to say that, but it is a bit more punishing because the ball is in and out of there so quickly. That sponginess is a real asset on the Loco, especially for drops and resets where you do guide the ball a little bit more rather than just dinking it back in. That extra dwell time makes you feel like you're in control of the ball rather than it being all paddle. The Boomstick is also so consistent and has such a big sweet spot that once you've dialed in the amount of swing speed you need for certain situations, it's fine, but it doesn't give you as much of an ability to feel your way through those shots. I know this is super technical, but try to think of it on a more macro level. This is spongier, so you have a bit more time to control the ball. This is instantaneous, so the paddle does all the work, and it's more inherently susceptible to pop-ups. Now for dinking, both of these are good, but nothing special, and that's also where there's a much less marked difference between the two, again, because the Loco doesn't have that much dwell time on super soft shots. But again, both are consistent, so you can dink with them. They're just power paddles. You don't get to accidentally overpower a dink with impunity. If you do, the ball goes high and you're probably going to lose the point. Before control, the Loco wins. That extra dwell time just about beats out the bigger sweet spot for me in the control game. You can't really go wrong with either of these though. They are probably the 2 power paddles that have the best control, with the J2NF being a close third. Both the Loco and the Boomstick have elite spin-on drives, and they're actually very similar in the way they spin the ball in those types of shots. If you remember in my Boomstick review, I said that this was a paddle that's unlike most others that I've tested. Instead of scooping the ball to produce spin, you just tilt the paddle face and trust that the paddle is going to grab onto it and produce enough spin to have it land before the baseline. It's a very similar sensation on the Loco. Once I got comfortable with it, I was just throwing the paddle at the ball, fully trusting it, and it was producing really heavy shots with that combination of spin and power. I'd probably still give the edge to the Boomstick on those shots. I don't know if it actually has more spin, but because it has a bit more power and I'm just as confident with it, I can produce a slightly heavier ball. But both are absolutely elite for drives, and it's a real pleasure to play with paddles like these. They translate so perfectly to the technique I've developed over years of playing tennis. Now we do need to talk about soft spin, because that's where I think the Loco sets itself apart from the Boomstick, and that's why for me it deserves to at least be in the conversation for paddle of the year. Soft spin is the Boomstick's kryptonite, and that's because no matter how you swing it, it has a short dwell time, which means you can't really slow things down and scoop the ball. Everything has to be fast, all out, all the time, and it has so much spin that you can get away with full pace spin from anywhere on the court, but it's always nice to feel like you can vary it up with your paddle. That's exactly what you get with the Loco, more variety. Because the dwell time is longer and spongier, you do feel like you have a bit more purchase to grab and scoop the ball when you slow it down. It's not like a soft paddle or the Ruby Pro that I reviewed last week, but you have the option to do that, whereas you don't really on the Boomstick. I can't tell you how important that is for confidence when you realize you've become too one-dimensional. Good players will notice when all you can do is drive, 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 and you can't vary it up. That ability to vary up your spin game is so important to keep your opponent on their toes, and there were plenty of times, especially when I was playing doubles, where instead of driving it really hard, I did hit a soft spin shot. Again, it's not the best paddle in the world for that, but because it has the spongiest feel of any EVA and EPP foam paddle, It's the best you're gonna get in this style. Same goes for roll volleys and rolled dinks. Just a bit more time to shape the ball. I did compare it to the Genesis for that. It's not as good, but better than the Boomstick. So that's another point to the Loco. For spin in general though, I am gonna call it a draw. Drives are just such a cheat code with the Boomstick. But variety and nuance keep just winning out with the Loco. So now we're gonna talk about who these paddles are actually made for. Well, first of all, if you don't want to spend $500 on a pickleball paddle, but you want a lot of the playability the Boomstick has to offer, the Loco is the next best option. Power, spin, control, feel, sweet spot, they're all similar enough to the point where this provides the closest hitting experience you'll get to the Boomstick. But beyond just value, because the Loco has more variety thanks to its spongier feel, this is going to be a better paddle for those of you who want a bit more performance in the touch game. Any soft shot, whether it's a soft spin shot or a more traditional flat shot like a drop, a reset, or a dink, I do feel more confident with the Loco. Now that's not to say I wouldn't go for the Boomstick. It does have marginally better performance in everything power related, so if you are primarily a power focused player, this is still the best paddle for you. In fact, I'd say straight up in singles, no paddle compares to the Boomstick. It still has enough soft game performance and everything else about it is just pretty much perfect for singles. And then you have more space on a singles court, so precision just isn't that important. So yeah, this is the best singles paddle. But I am gonna spend a lot more time on court with both of these over the next month because I really want to see which one I actually play better with, especially doubles, because I'm definitely not as good at doubles as I am at singles. So I wouldn't be surprised if I end up switching to the Loco. I've also got the black opal now, which I'll get reviewed as soon as possible. But yeah, lots of fun stuff coming, and it's gonna be a big battle for Paddle of the Year this year. I can't wait to make that top 5. But anyways, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, if you want to demo either the Boomstick, the Loco, or any of the paddles we talk about on this channel, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.